The morning waves crashed against the volcanic black sand with rhythmic persistence, each surge bringing fresh landing craft toward the island's shores. It was the 19th day of February in 1945, and the time approached 9 in the morning when specialized vehicles began rolling off the ramps of the fifth wave assault craft onto what the military planners had designated as Green Beach on Iwo Jima's southeastern coast. Among the standard military equipment coming ashore that morning, 8 peculiar Sherman tanks drew immediate attention from anyone who understood armored warfare. These weren't the typical M4A3 medium tanks that had become the backbone of American armored operations across multiple theaters of war. Someone had fundamentally altered these machines, converting them into something entirely different, something the men who would operate them had already begun calling Zippo tanks in reference to the ubiquitous pocket lighter that seemed to work every time you needed it. The Japanese defenders watching from concealed positions throughout the island would soon develop their own terminology for these vehicles, calling them Haino Kuruma, which translated roughly as chariots of fire, though the translation carried connotations of divine retribution that the English phrase couldn't quite capture. The distribution of these 8 converted vehicles had been carefully planned, with 4 machines assigned to support the operations of the 4th Tank Battalion, while the remaining 4 would operate under the command structure of the 5th Tank Battalion. Each of these modified Shermans carried specialized equipment capable of projecting streams of napalm-thickened gasoline across distances that could reach nearly 400 feet when atmospheric conditions proved favorable, and the crew managed the weapon system optimally. The intended targets were the fortified positions that conventional military wisdom had deemed essentially impossible to assault without accepting catastrophic casualties. What transpired over the following weeks represented far more than just another tactical innovation in the long catalogue of military technological advancement. The deployment of these weapons created a psychological crisis of unprecedented magnitude for the Japanese soldiers who had dedicated months to constructing defensive positions they genuinely believed would prove impervious to American assault tactics. The story of why these weapons proved so devastatingly effective begins not on the beaches of Iwo Jima, but in the aftermath of another battle fought months earlier and hundreds of miles to the north. The fall of Saipan in July of 1944 had sent shockwaves through Japanese military command structures and forced a fundamental reassessment of defensive doctrine that had guided their operations throughout the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi received orders to command the defense of Iwo Jima, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he approached this assignment by conducting a systematic analysis of every major American amphibious assault launched since the Marines had stormed ashore at Tarawa. His conclusions contradicted 3 full years of established Japanese tactical doctrine and represented a radical departure from everything the Imperial Japanese Army had practiced in defensive operations. Kuribayashi determined through careful study that American forces could not be stopped during their initial beach assault, that attempting to defeat them at the waterline represented a wasteful expenditure of troops and resources that would accomplish nothing except accelerating Japanese defeat. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, some 75 feet below the surface where shell fire and aerial bombardment could never reach, Kuribayashi established his command post, and from this subterranean headquarters drafted the document that would guide Japanese defensive operations. Defense Order No. 1 bore the date of December 1, 1944, and its contents would have been considered heretical by most Japanese commanders who had fought previous battles across the Pacific. The directive stated with stark clarity that Japanese forces would not engage American troops on the beaches, that defenders would allow the assault waves to land without opposition, that patience rather than immediate counterattack would characterize the defensive response, and that Japanese soldiers would kill their enemies from positions the Americans simply could not reach through conventional assault methods. Kuribayashi understood that the fundamental mathematics of defensive warfare had shifted dramatically against Japanese forces. At Tarawa, approximately 4,500 Japanese defenders had died in just 76 hours of intense frontal combat, their bodies strewn across the beaches and tide pools after banzai charges that accomplished nothing except their own destruction. At Saipan, 30,000 defenders had been systematically eliminated over the course of less than a month of mobile defensive operations that allowed American firepower superiority to assert itself again and again. But here on Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi commanded 21,000 men, and he intended to employ them not in glorious charges or desperate last stands, but from within an underground fortress system that represented the most sophisticated defensive engineering project undertaken by Japanese forces during the entire war. The volcanic rock of the island concealed 11 miles of interconnecting tunnels that linked together approximately 1,500 separate man-made cave positions and concrete pillboxes, creating a three-dimensional battlefield where defenders could move unseen between positions, while American forces struggled to identify where fire was even coming from. The construction of this underground fortress had consumed enormous resources and required approximately 25% of the entire garrison, which translated to some 5,250 men, to work under conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Inside the tunnels being carved from volcanic rock, ambient temperatures regularly reached 30 to 50 degrees Celsius, which those more familiar with Fahrenheit measurements would recognize as temperatures ranging from 86 to 122 degrees. The volcanic nature of the rock meant toxic sulfur fumes pervaded the work areas, creating atmospheric conditions so dangerous that workers could only dig for 5-minute intervals before needing to evacuate to fresher air. The individual defensive positions ranged dramatically in scale, from small caves designed to shelter just 3 or 4 soldiers to massive underground chambers capable of holding 300 to 400 men with their equipment and supplies. Kuribayashi's own command post featured 150 meters of connecting tunnel systems that linked multiple chambers, while Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the southern portion of the island, contained 7 distinct levels of underground fortifications stacked vertically within the mountain itself. Japanese engineers had constructed 800 concrete pillboxes throughout the defensive system, and these were not the hasty field fortifications that characterized earlier defensive works, but substantial structures with walls measuring up to 4 feet in thickness. Every aspect of the design reflected lessons learned from 3 years of analyzing American assault tactics and adapting to counter them. Japanese defenders knew about flamethrowers, specifically the M1 and M2 portable units carried by individual soldiers that could project flame across distances of 40 to 60 feet. The cave designers had accounted for these weapons by extending entrance tunnels for 100 feet or more before they reached the actual living chambers where troops would shelter, meaning portable flamethrower operators would need to advance deep into confined spaces where Japanese defenders could easily kill them before they could employ their weapons effectively. The engineers knew about satchel charges, the explosive devices infantry could carry and throw into defensive positions, and they calculated that the volcanic rock forming Iwo Jima's geological structure could withstand anything portable enough for soldiers to carry up to a fortified position. What Japanese defenders had created represented what military engineers studying the fortifications after the battle would characterize as the most sophisticated defensive network constructed by any force during World War II. 21,000 soldiers had essentially vanished inside an island measuring just 8 square miles, hidden within a fortress that rendered them nearly invisible and seemingly invulnerable. They had calculated and planned for every weapon system in the American arsenal, accounting for naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, tank cannon fire, artillery strikes, portable flamethrowers, and explosive charges. They had prepared for everything except one weapon system that had been developed in secret and that none of their intelligence sources had reported, a main battle tank modified to project liquid fire across distances they considered physically impossible for such weapons to achieve. The weapon that would ultimately break open Iwo Jima's cave defenses traced its origins to desperate circumstances encountered by American forces during earlier operations in the Marshall Islands, 13 months before the first landing craft approached Iwo Jima's beaches. On the 1st of February in 1944, Marine tanks participating in the assault on Roy Namur had encountered Japanese bunkers that simply shrugged off direct hits from 75mm main guns, the bunker walls absorbing solid shot and high explosive rounds without suffering penetration or significant damage. The solution emerged through collaborative efforts between the Naval Construction Battalions, universally known as Seabees, and the Chemical Warfare Service. Teams working at the Navy Yard facilities in Pearl Harbor began experimenting with battle-damaged M4A3 Sherman tanks that were no longer suitable for conventional service, converting these vehicles into platforms for projecting flame across distances far exceeding what portable systems could achieve. The technical designation assigned to these converted vehicles was POACWSH-1. An acronym developed specifically to describe their intended employment in Pacific theater operations. The technical specifications documented in Navy Department records revealed just how revolutionary these weapons actually were when compared to existing flame projector systems. The main gun that normally occupied the Sherman's turret had been completely removed and replaced with a Mark I Navy flame projector, an entirely different weapon system operating on principles unlike conventional firearms. The system generated compressed gas pressure measured at 300 pounds per square inch and could maintain continuous flame projection for 55 to 80 seconds, depending on how the crew managed the flow rates and pressure settings. The fuel consisted of regular gasoline that had been chemically thickened using napalm, which was actually aluminum salts derived from naphthenic and palmitic acids, compounds developed in 1942 by research teams led by Louis Fieser working at Harvard University. Initial testing conducted at Schofield Barracks during March of 1944 demonstrated that under optimal conditions with favorable wind and proper pressure management, flame streams could reach distances approaching 400 feet, though typical combat employment would see effective ranges settling somewhere between 150 and 200 yards, still dramatically exceeding the capabilities of man-portable systems. The flame projector could deliver what observers described as a solid rod of fire, a coherent stream of burning fuel that maintained its integrity across considerable distances, and that crews could play across target areas with devastating effect, sweeping the flame back and forth like water from a fire hose. During the testing phases, observers discovered something that would prove critically important in actual combat employment against cave systems. When thickened gasoline entered confined spaces like caves or bunkers, it didn't simply splash against the entrance and burn there. Instead, the fuel would flow through tunnel systems, following the basic physics of gravity, running down passages, following slopes and grades, flowing around corners and through defensive angles, and continuing to burn throughout this movement at temperatures reaching 2000 degrees Fahrenheit while simultaneously consuming all oxygen available in the confined spaces. The 21st of February in 1945 marked D+2 in the operational timeline, meaning American forces had been ashore for 2 full days and were continuing to push inland against fierce resistance. At 14:30 hours in the afternoon, the first combat deployment of flame tanks occurred on the eastern slopes of Mount Suribachi, where Marine casualties had been mounting steadily as concealed Japanese positions continued to pour accurate fire onto troops attempting to advance up the volcanic slopes. Traditional assault tactics that worked reasonably well on open ground were proving extraordinarily costly when applied to terrain where every rock outcrop might conceal a firing position and where every cave entrance might shelter multiple defenders. According to the detailed records maintained by the 5th Tank Battalion, one of the flame tanks that crews had christened Satan advanced to a position approximately 150 yards from what intelligence officers suspected were cave positions based on observed enemy fire patterns. At precisely 14:37 hours, the flame gunner triggered the Mark I projector system for the first time in actual combat conditions against a defended position. The official after-action reports compiled from multiple observer accounts described effects that exceeded even the optimistic projections from testing phases. Streams of liquid fire maintained coherent structure across hundreds of feet of open air before splashing against the volcanic rock of the mountainside and immediately flowing into whatever cave entrances presented themselves. The napalm-thickened gasoline displayed exactly the flowing characteristics that testing had predicted, running down entrance tunnels, following gradients around the defensive angles that Japanese engineers had carefully designed to stop conventional weapons, pooling in low spots throughout the tunnel systems and continuing to burn throughout these spaces. The Japanese defensive manual that Allied forces captured and translated after the battle had dedicated exactly one paragraph to the threat posed by flame weapons, and that single paragraph revealed assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners had assumed flame weapons meant portable flamethrowers carried by individual soldiers, systems with effective ranges of approximately 20 meters and fuel supplies that limited actual firing time to 8 to 10 seconds at most. The flame tanks carried vastly larger fuel supplies measured in hundreds of gallons rather than the few gallons portable systems could accommodate, and they could deliver sustained flame streams lasting well over a minute of continuous fire. The physics of what happened when flame entered confined defensive spaces was documented in considerable detail by Chemical Warfare Service technical specialists. The Mark I flame projector delivered multiple gallons of thickened fuel every second while operating at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, creating a massive flow of burning material into whatever space it targeted. Upon entering a cave system, multiple lethal mechanisms operated simultaneously to create unsurvivable conditions. Direct immolation occurred immediately for anyone in contact with fuel burning at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, creating instant fatal casualties. Radiant heat caused third-degree burns on any exposed flesh at considerable distances from the actual flame, meaning soldiers didn't need to be touched by fire to receive mortal wounds. Complete oxygen depletion occurred within just seconds in any confined space as the burning fuel consumed everything available for combustion. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide concentrations reached immediately lethal levels as combustion products filled tunnel systems faster than fresh air could enter. The thermal expansion of volcanic rock subjected to extreme temperatures could cause structural collapse of tunnel systems, burying defenders even if they somehow survived the other effects. A single sustained burst from a flame tank could create conditions throughout entire interconnected cave systems that simply would not support human life, and those conditions would persist long after the actual flame stream stopped. The 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company that had worked extensively on perfecting stabilized flamethrower fuel mixtures documented in their reports from June 1945 that the thickened fuel mixture would adhere to surfaces throughout cave systems and continue burning for extended periods, making any attempt to reoccupy the positions completely impossible until all fuel had been consumed and temperatures dropped back to levels where human beings could survive. The 23rd of February in 1945, D+4 in operational terms, saw the final assault on Mount Suribachi's summit defences. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Marines during this operation, and his forces received substantial support from flame tanks during the reduction of the defensive positions that honeycombed the volcano's slopes. Marine Corps records indicated that intelligence specialists had identified 165 separate cave positions on the volcano's slopes, each of which would have required infantry assault under traditional tactics, and such assaults would have cost dozens of casualties per position based on experiences from earlier Pacific battles. The flame tank crews had developed new tactics through just a few days of combat experience, and these tactics were being documented in tank battalion operational reports almost in real time. The tanks operated in pairs for mutual support, with one flame tank accompanied by one standard Sherman providing covering fire with its conventional 75mm main gun. The approach to each defensive position followed a systematic pattern that crews had refined through trial and error. First, advance to effective range, which typically meant 150 to 200 yards from suspected positions. Second, suppress any visible defensive positions with conventional cannon fire to prevent Japanese troops from targeting the flame tank during its vulnerable firing period. Third, engage caves with sustained flame for 30 to 40 seconds, more than enough time to ensure fuel penetrated deep into tunnel systems. Fourth, displace immediately to new positions and wait while observers assess the effects. The 28th Marines After-Action Report for February 23rd documented results that represented a complete transformation of cave warfare mathematics. 47 cave positions were neutralized during the day's operations. Friendly casualties totaled exactly 3 wounded. Enemy soldiers killed were estimated at approximately 800. This represented a complete reversal of the casualty ratios that military planners had expected for cave warfare operations, where attackers typically suffered far heavier losses than defenders. Radio intercepts decoded by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific documented desperate Japanese command communications that revealed the catastrophic impact flame weapons were having on defensive plans. Messages from the Suribachi garrison requested permission for final banzai charges, explicitly stating that positions could not be maintained against flame weapons and that death in combat was preferable to the alternative. Combat operations drove immediate battlefield modifications that were documented by construction battalion maintenance units working to keep the flame tanks operational. Initial problems encountered in combat included fuel mixture adjustments necessary for cold morning temperatures that affected fuel viscosity and flow characteristics, and ignition system failures caused by volcanic dust infiltrating electrical components. Solutions developed by maintenance crews and tank operators included installing secondary electric ignition systems to provide redundancy, and welding additional armor plates in vulnerable areas to protect against damage from volcanic rock fragments thrown up by shell fire. Within just days of combat operations, crews discovered through experimentation that mixing diesel fuel with the napalm gasoline mixture created denser smoke that provided better penetration into cave ventilation systems while also affecting how the fuel flowed through confined spaces. They developed what they termed the splash technique, which involved deliberately overshooting cave mouth entrances to let burning fuel run down cliff faces and into hidden entrances that weren't visible from the flame tank's firing position. Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi commanded what remained of the Japanese 26th Tank Regiment, and he attempted to counter the flame tanks using his remaining Type 97 medium tanks in direct combat. The engagement that occurred on February 24th lasted only minutes according to American Tank Battalion records. 3 Type 97 tanks were completely destroyed without inflicting any damage whatsoever on American tanks, demonstrating the overwhelming superiority of American armored vehicles. Nishi himself would die later in the battle, according to Japanese records recovered after the war, trapped in a cave somewhere in the northern sector of the island. The 26th of February saw American forces assault Hills 382 and 362A, and these operations demonstrated flame tank capabilities against the most sophisticated interconnected bunker systems the Japanese had constructed anywhere on the island. The defensive complex beneath Hill 382 featured multiple tunnel levels connecting dozens of separate defensive positions, according to captured Japanese engineering documents that American intelligence specialists translated after these positions fell. Marine Corps operational records described the assault beginning at 06:30 hours in the morning, with flame tanks employing a new tactic that targeted ventilation shafts rather than obvious cave mouth entrances. The tactic allowed gravity to distribute burning fuel throughout entire tunnel complexes, as fuel flowed down ventilation systems into lower chambers. Official reports noted that smoke from burning fuel began emerging from dozens of previously unidentified exits scattered across the hillside, effectively mapping out the entire 3-dimensional tunnel system that defenders had spent months constructing. The intelligence section of the 3rd Marine Division compiled reports describing what their analysts termed cascade collapse in Japanese morale and defensive determination. The psychological impact of flame weapons was proving to exceed their purely physical destructive effects, creating a situation unprecedented in Pacific War combat operations. For the first time in the entire Pacific campaign, significant numbers of Japanese soldiers were abandoning defensive positions before being killed, and in some cases were actually surrendering rather than fighting to the death. Marine intelligence reports noted that Japanese prisoners were using specific terms when describing flame tanks, referring to them as demon weapons and dragon's breath, terminology that revealed genuine terror rather than just tactical concern. The 216 prisoners taken during the entire battle for Iwo Jima represented the first significant Japanese surrenders witnessed during any Pacific War operation, and post-war interrogations revealed that many of these men had surrendered specifically to avoid death by burning, considering that particular form of death so horrific that it overcame their training and indoctrination. Captured Japanese documents that American intelligence specialists collected throughout the battle indicated that entire units were abandoning carefully prepared defensive positions upon merely receiving reports that flame tanks were approaching their sector. This represented a complete breakdown of the Bushido warrior code that had sustained Japanese resistance through dozens of previous battles, where soldiers had fought literally to the last man rather than surrender. The 2nd of March saw intensive combat operations focused on Motoyama Airfield No. 2, and this battle saw systematic employment of flame tanks in what amounted to a deliberate clearing operation. Japanese forces had constructed 280 interconnected strongpoints around the airfield perimeter, according to captured defensive plans that showed just how thoroughly they had fortified this critical terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Chambers commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Marines during this operation, and his operations order documented in stark terms that conventional reduction of the airfield defences using standard infantry assault tactics would be estimated to cost over 1,000 casualties. His solution was to employ flame tanks to execute what he termed preparatory reduction before infantry forces even attempted to advance into the defensive zone. Marine Corps records show that the operation proceeded grid square by grid square across the military map, with flame tanks systematically engaging every suspected defensive position before infantry moved forward to occupy the ground. Multiple Japanese positions were found completely abandoned before assault forces even reached them, with supplies and personal effects left behind in circumstances suggesting that defenders had fled in panic rather than conducting any kind of organized withdrawal. The operation demonstrated conclusively that Japanese forces were choosing self-preservation over death for the first time on this scale in Pacific combat. Operations conducted on the 10th of March introduced experimental seismic detection equipment operated by naval technical specialists who had been brought forward specifically for this purpose. Using modified equipment originally developed for oil field exploration, these teams could detect underground tunnel systems by analyzing seismic vibrations transmitted through volcanic rock, providing flame tank commanders with targeting data for positions that had no visible surface features suggesting their existence. Major General Graves Erskine commanded the 3rd Marine Division, and his after-action report described this innovation as three-dimensional warfare, noting that American forces were now fighting simultaneously above ground on the surface and underground in tunnel complexes, creating a multi-layered battlefield unlike anything seen in previous operations. The combination of seismic detection capabilities and flame weapons proved devastatingly effective against even the deepest tunnel complexes that Japanese engineers had believed would remain undetectable. By the 16th of March, flame tank operations had evolved considerably from their initial employment just 3 weeks earlier. Standard effective range remained 150 to 200 yards under typical combat conditions, but crews had experimented extensively with pressure settings and fuel mixture modifications to extend maximum range when tactical circumstances required longer shots. Marine Tank Battalion records document numerous technical innovations that crews and maintenance personnel developed during actual combat operations, refining the weapons through practical experience rather than laboratory testing. The psychological impact of these weapons extended far beyond their actual technical capabilities in ways that profoundly affected Japanese defensive effectiveness. Japanese communications intercepted and decoded by radio intelligence units indicated that widespread belief existed among defenders that American flame weapons possessed essentially unlimited range, and this belief contributed to the defensive collapse that intelligence analysts were documenting. Official Marine Corps records compiled after the battle provide comprehensive documentation of flame tank operations throughout the campaign. The operational period extended from February 19th through March 26th of 1945, spanning 36 days of continuous combat operations. 8 flame tanks were deployed total, divided equally with 4 assigned to the 4th Tank Battalion and 4 to the 5th Tank Battalion. Daily fuel consumption during peak operational periods ranged from 5,000 to 10,000 gallons, requiring extensive logistics support to maintain operations. Cave positions neutralized numbered in the hundreds according to unit operational records, though exact totals vary between different reporting sources. Japanese casualties directly attributed to flame weapons numbered in the thousands, though exact figures remain undetermined because the nature of cave warfare made casualty assessment extremely difficult. Estimated Marine casualties prevented by flame tank employment also numbered in the thousands when calculated based on traditional assault casualty rates for cave reduction operations. Comparative analysis conducted by military operations researchers showed that traditional cave assault tactics required multiple infantry squads to reduce each position, with casualty rates typically running 20 to 30% for each position assaulted. Flame tank operations could neutralize multiple positions with minimal or zero friendly casualties, fundamentally altering the mathematics of cave warfare. The comparison becomes even more stark when examining individual acts of heroism required under traditional tactics. Corporal Herschel Williams received the Medal of Honor for his actions operating a portable flamethrower during the Iwo Jima campaign, and his citation describes how he single-handedly eliminated multiple Japanese positions while covered by riflemen, enabling Marine advances that would otherwise have stalled. Williams later provided testimony about the tactical importance of flame weapons in general, noting that the Japanese had constructed defensive positions specifically designed to withstand everything American forces normally employed, but that fire possessed unique characteristics that allowed it to go where bullets couldn't reach, finding every space and corner in ways that conventional weapons simply couldn't match. Williams specifically stated that one flame tank could accomplish what would have cost dozens of men to achieve using standard infantry assault methods. Marine tank crews who operated the flame weapons documented extensively the psychological burden that came with employing these particular weapons. Veterans Administration studies conducted during post-war years found that flame tank crewmen experienced combat stress reactions and what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder at substantially higher rates than crews from other armoured units. The intimate nature of flame warfare, where crews possessed visual and auditory awareness of the effects their weapons were having on enemy soldiers, created unique psychological challenges that differed significantly from the more impersonal nature of conventional tank warfare, where targets were often distant and effects were less immediately visible. Captured Japanese documents combined with testimony from post-war interrogations of the few survivors revealed the complete inadequacy of Japanese preparations for confronting flame tank warfare. Japanese forces possessed extensive experience dealing with portable flamethrowers and had developed effective countermeasures against those weapons, but they had not anticipated and therefore had not prepared for vehicle-mounted flame weapons, possessing both dramatically extended range and massive fuel capacity that allowed sustained fire. General Kuribayashi's final message, transmitted before his death sometime in late March, acknowledged in unusually frank terms the complete failure of Japanese defensive strategy, stating explicitly that enemy flame tanks had neutralized Japanese cave defenses, that positions requiring months of construction labor were being destroyed in mere minutes, and that American technological superiority had overcome Japanese fighting spirit. This message, intercepted and decoded by American radio intelligence personnel, confirmed the absolutely decisive impact flame weapons had achieved. Post-war testimony provided by the small number of Japanese soldiers who survived the battle confirmed the terror these weapons inspired in ways that other weapons did not. One survivor providing testimony to war crimes, investigators stated that soldiers who had faced death courageously in numerous previous battles fled in panic from flame tanks, and that the weapons created a form of death that contradicted fundamental Japanese concepts of honorable military service, making it psychologically impossible for many soldiers to maintain their positions when flame tanks engaged. The lessons learned from flame tank employment at Iwo Jima were immediately incorporated into operational planning for Okinawa, where American forces launched the next major amphibious operation beginning on April 1st of 1945. Marine Corps planning records show significantly expanded flame tank deployment at Okinawa, with improved tactics directly based on experience gained at Iwo Jima just weeks earlier. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara served as operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa, and according to captured documents he had studied Iwo Jima reports extensively and incorporated those lessons into Okinawa defensive preparations. His defensive plans included water reservoirs intended to flood tunnel systems if flame weapons were employed, extended tunnel systems designed to dissipate heat and combustion products, and specialized flame barriers constructed at tunnel entrances, though all of these countermeasures proved ineffective against improved American flame tank tactics. Marine units deploying to Okinawa received enhanced flame tank support, backed by specialized fuel supply infrastructure that had been lacking during initial Iwo Jima operations. The 713th Flamethrower Tank Battalion was specially created for Okinawa operations and documented even more effective employment than had been achieved at Iwo Jima, demonstrating that flame tank tactics continued to evolve and improve. The flame tank operations represented far more than just the weapons themselves, requiring massive industrial support infrastructure that extended all the way back to chemical plants in the continental United States. Navy construction battalions constructed fuel storage and mixing facilities even while combat operations continued, building infrastructure under fire to ensure flame tanks could maintain operations. By the battle's conclusion, this infrastructure included underground fuel storage facilities protected from Japanese artillery fire, specialized mixing stations where napalm compounds were blended with gasoline in precise ratios, miles of fuel distribution pipeline connecting storage areas to forward positions, and forward resupply points positioned close to actual combat areas. The Chemical Warfare Service documented in extensive reports that sustaining flame tank operations required daily delivery of thousands upon thousands of gallons of fuel components to the island, creating logistics challenges that demanded careful planning and substantial shipping capacity. The entire supply chain from stateside chemical plants producing napalm compounds to frontline fuel mixing stations demonstrated American industrial capacity operating at scales that Japanese forces simply could not begin to match, representing yet another dimension of the fundamental industrial superiority that ultimately decided the Pacific War's outcome. Medical records maintained by Navy hospital ships operating offshore documented the unique casualty patterns created by flame weapons employment. Burns, smoke inhalation injuries, and carbon monoxide poisoning required specialized medical treatment that differed significantly from treating conventional combat wounds. The hospital ship Samaritan reported treating both American and Japanese burn casualties, though documentation notes that Japanese soldiers captured after flame weapon employment initially resisted medical treatment, apparently believing they had dishonored themselves by surviving when they should have died in combat. International Red Cross representatives who were permitted to inspect prisoner-of-war facilities documented that captured Japanese soldiers expressed particular fear when discussing flame weapons, a fear that appeared qualitatively different from their attitudes toward other weapon systems, and this fear contributed substantially to the unprecedented number of surrenders witnessed at Iwo Jima compared to all previous Pacific War battles. The flame tank innovations developed at Iwo Jima influenced military weapons development for decades following World War II. Official military histories trace direct developmental lineage from these weapons through Korean War-era flame tanks, Vietnam-era flame weapons employed in tunnel warfare, and modern thermobaric weapons that operate on fundamentally similar principles of using flowing burning compounds to clear enclosed spaces and consume oxygen in confined areas. The fundamental principle of using flowing burning liquid to clear enclosed spaces remains relevant to contemporary military operations, and modern military forces continue to employ weapons based on these same basic concepts. Contemporary military doctrine for tunnel and cave warfare operations still references lessons learned from Iwo Jima flame tank employment, and military training programs include detailed case studies of these operations when teaching officers about fighting in complex terrain. The United States Marine Corps official history of the Pacific War includes extensive discussion of flame tank development and employment, stating explicitly that the development of flame-throwing tanks represented one of the most significant American technical innovations during the entire Pacific War, and that at Iwo Jima these weapons proved absolutely decisive in reducing Japanese cave positions that would have cost thousands of Marine casualties if attacked using conventional tactics. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded all Pacific Fleet operations, noted in his official report that flame-throwing tanks proved to be the single most effective weapon system for reducing Japanese cave defenses, and that without these weapons, American casualties would have been infinitely greater than the already substantial losses actually suffered. General Holland Smith, who commanded 5 amphibious corps during the operation, wrote in his after-action assessment that the 8 flame tanks deployed to Iwo Jima possessed combat value equivalent to an entire battalion of infantry when measured by their ability to neutralize Japanese fortifications, and that they saved literally countless Marine lives. While flame tanks dramatically reduced American casualties, their employment created unique moral and ethical challenges that were documented in military chaplain reports compiled during and after the battle. Marines struggled psychologically with the nature of the weapon, even while recognizing its absolute necessity for accomplishing their mission with acceptable casualties. Military chaplains serving with combat units reported substantially increased requests for counseling from flame tank crews compared to personnel from other types of units, and these counseling sessions often focused on reconciling the horrific effects of the weapons with the men's understanding of themselves as moral individuals. The Japanese perspective, documented through extensive post-war testimony combined with captured documents, reveals the complete collapse of their defensive strategy when confronted with weapons they had never anticipated. Japanese forces that had prepared themselves mentally and emotionally to die in conventional combat found themselves fleeing from a form of death they had never trained for and never psychologically prepared to face. And this psychological defeat preceded and ultimately enabled the physical defeat of Japanese forces throughout the island. Military legal reviews conducted both during and after the war examined flame weapon employment and confirmed their legality under international law as it existed in 1945. The weapons were not specifically prohibited by either the Geneva Conventions or the Hague Conventions that governed land warfare, and their use against military fortifications was considered entirely legitimate under the laws of war as understood by all major powers at that time. Post-war war crimes trials that prosecuted numerous other violations did not result in any prosecutions related to flame weapon use by either American or Japanese forces. International legal scholars reviewing the operations concluded that the weapons represented a legitimate response to Japanese cave fortifications that could not be effectively reduced by alternative means without accepting casualties that would themselves raise ethical questions about commander responsibility to preserve their own forces. The annual reunion and honor ceremonies conducted on Iwo Jima beginning in 1970 have brought together American and Japanese veterans for joint remembrance events, and these gatherings have been extensively documented by both American and Japanese government historians as demonstrations of reconciliation between former enemies. At the 40th anniversary reunion conducted in 1985, Japanese and American veterans met together at specific sites where flame tanks had been employed during the battle, and these meetings included remarkably frank discussions of the weapon's effects. Japanese survivors acknowledged the weapon's devastating effectiveness, while Americans expressed genuine respect for Japanese courage in the face of overwhelming technological superiority, and these meetings, documented by military historians on both sides, show how former enemies found common ground in their shared experience of combat, even while acknowledging the terrible nature of that experience. The 80th anniversary reunion, held in March 2025, included only 7 American veterans, all over 100 years old, highlighting the inevitable passing of the generation that fought World War II. Their final testimonies, recorded specifically for historical preservation programs, emphasize a consistent theme, simultaneously acknowledging both the absolute necessity of flame weapons for accomplishing military objectives with acceptable casualties, and the horror of employing weapons that created such terrible forms of death. The National Archives contains extensive documentation of flame tank operations at Iwo Jima, preserved in multiple record groups. Tank Battalion war diaries provide day-by-day operational records. After-action reports compiled at various command levels offer analytical perspectives on weapon effectiveness. Technical assessments conducted by chemical warfare service specialists document weapon performance under actual combat conditions. Japanese documents captured immediately after the battle, combined with testimony gathered during post-war interrogations of survivors, confirm from the enemy perspective the weapon's psychological and tactical impact. The Marine Corps History Division maintains official records that collectively document how flame tanks fundamentally transformed cave warfare tactics in ways that influenced military operations for decades afterward. These weapons demonstrated conclusively that technological innovation could overcome defensive advantages that had previously cost thousands of casualties in earlier Pacific War operations, where American forces lacked such capabilities. Photographic evidence captured by combat photographers who accompanied assault forces shows flame tanks projecting their streams of burning fuel toward Japanese positions, and these photographs preserved in military archives provide visual documentation of the weapon's capabilities. Film footage shot during actual combat operations and now preserved in both military and civilian archives captures the weapon's devastating effectiveness against cave fortifications, showing clearly why Japanese defenders found these weapons so psychologically devastating. The deployment of just 8 flame tanks to Iwo Jima represented far more than a simple tactical innovation or another incremental improvement in weapons technology. It demonstrated at a fundamental level how industrial capacity combined with technological development could completely alter combat dynamics in ways that rendered months of enemy preparation essentially worthless. These weapons destroyed in minutes the defensive advantages that Japanese forces had spent months creating through enormous expenditures of labor under dangerous and uncomfortable conditions. The streams of liquid fire that could reach under optimal conditions nearly 400 feet didn't merely clear caves of enemy soldiers. They cleared away any remaining illusions about what industrial-age warfare actually meant when one side possessed overwhelming technological and industrial advantages. The physics of liquid fire flowing through tunnel systems as inevitably as water flowing downhill mirrored in many ways the inevitability of American victory flowing from fundamental industrial superiority that Japanese forces could not overcome, regardless of how courageously they fought or how cleverly they prepared defensive positions. Japanese troops who abandoned their carefully prepared caves when confronted by flame tanks were making entirely rational decisions when facing a technology that transformed their fortifications from defensive advantages into death traps, where every tunnel that had been designed to provide safety now became a channel funneling burning fuel deeper into the defensive complex. Their careful preparations based on studying 3 years of Pacific War combat proved worthless against liquid fire that followed gravity through every tunnel and consumed oxygen from every chamber, rendering impossible the close-quarters combat where Japanese defenders had expected to inflict maximum casualties. The flame tanks unquestionably saved thousands of American lives by eliminating the need for the kind of cave-by-cave infantry fighting that would have been required using traditional assault methods, but they achieved this by inflicting a form of death that haunted the men who employed these weapons and absolutely terrified those who faced them. This fundamental duality, representing salvation for American forces while creating unprecedented horror for Japanese defenders, defines the weapon's historical legacy in ways that simple tactical assessments cannot fully capture. Military historians examining Iwo Jima operations universally recognize flame tanks as a decisive innovation that shortened the battle's duration and dramatically reduced American casualties from what they would have been using conventional assault tactics. The weapons demonstrated with brutal clarity that in modern industrial warfare, technological superiority can completely overcome human courage and determination when the disparity in capabilities becomes sufficiently overwhelming. The 8 flame tanks deployed to Iwo Jima proved a fundamental truth about industrial-age warfare that would be demonstrated repeatedly throughout the 20th century and beyond. Victory in modern combat belongs not necessarily to whichever side demonstrates greater bravery or possesses stronger fighting spirit, but rather to whichever side fields superior tools and possesses the industrial capacity to employ those tools effectively across sustained operations. The Japanese defenders discovered through terrible experience that warrior spirit provided no defense against liquid fire, that personal courage could not overcome basic chemistry and physics, and that determination and willingness to die meant absolutely nothing when flames flowed through tunnels following the same gravitational principles that govern water seeking its level. No amount of bravery could prevent burning fuel from consuming oxygen, no degree of courage could protect against 2,000-degree temperatures, and no strength of spirit could overcome carbon monoxide poisoning in confined spaces. The battle for Iwo Jima reached its conclusion on March 26 of 1945, after 36 days of continuous combat operations that ranks among the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders who had spent months preparing their underground fortress, roughly 20,000 died during the battle. Only slightly over 1,000 surrendered, and even this unprecedented number of surrenders represented less than 5% of the original garrison. American forces suffered casualties totaling 6,140 killed and 17,913 wounded, according to official figures compiled after the battle, and without flame tanks providing a means to neutralize cave defenses without close infantry assault, these casualty figures would have been significantly higher based on combat experience from earlier Pacific battles. The transformation was absolutely complete, from Japanese faith in defensive fortifications providing survival to recognition that technological innovation could negate any defensive position, regardless of how carefully it was prepared or how courageously it was defended. The flame tanks had demonstrated with finality that in the arithmetic of modern industrial warfare, industrial capacity multiplied by technological innovation equals victory regardless of whatever human courage or tactical skill exists on the opposing side of the equation. When one side can field weapons that the other side has no effective countermeasures against and no way to match through their own industrial production, the outcome becomes mathematically predetermined. Today, the island known as Iwo Jima, which has been returned to its original Japanese name of Iwo To, stands as a permanent monument to the terrible price of victory in modern industrial warfare. The caves that once sheltered Japanese defenders remain largely as they were in 1945, and some still show visible scorch marks from flame tank operations conducted 80 years ago. These physical remnants serve as permanent testimony to the precise moment when liquid fire transformed the fundamental nature of cave warfare and demonstrated with devastating clarity the decisive power of industrial might when applied through technological innovation in modern combat operations. The lessons learned in those caves echo through military doctrine to this day, reminding each new generation of military professionals that technology matters, that industrial capacity matters, and that innovation can render obsolete in moments what seemed invulnerable just hours before.